Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this exciting webinar that we are about to host for the next hour. Today, we have the great opportunity to learn from our friends at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy how we can understand how money moves in disasters. My name is Kendall Clausen, and I am the President and CEO of Grantmakers of Oregon and Southwest Washington. I'm happy to be here as a co-host of this event with our friends and colleagues and teammates over at the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Just to give you a quick little overview of why we're here. I will tell you that we have been having this conversation for over a year. NAO and GOSW have been discussing how important it is for us to understand how systems work, particularly when it comes to how we are responding to and preparing for disasters. And so we have this great opportunity to learn from a group of people who are very adept at this entire system. So today we're joined by Regine Webster, who's the Vice President for the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and her colleague Kim Mayfis, the Senior Associate at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and then our good friend Jim White, who's the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association. We look forward to having this conversation with you. I think this is the moment in time after 6 months of crisis after crisis after crisis that we need to get ourselves in order, that we know how things work, so that if anything else were to occur, we can come together in a systematic way as a community. So we're excited that you're all here. We look forward to an invigorating conversation. We encourage you to also ask as many questions that are on your mind. That will certainly help us as we're thinking forward about how we put some of these great tools and this information into action. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to pass it over to my co-pilot, Jim White.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kendall. Appreciate that. I'm going to just kind of walk you through some logistical issues, and we want to get right into the presentation. So next slide, Curtis. So our agenda today, we've done the introductions. You're going to see Regine and Kim here in a moment. We're going to have them present to us their, they spent a lot of time thinking about disasters, and we're going to have them talk today about understanding how the money moves in a disaster, how actually the federal, the private, and the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors come together in cases of major disasters like we're dealing with here in Oregon. We are going to have a facilitated Q&A, and I'll facilitate that. And we're going to try to wrap it up right at 11 so that you all can get back to the important work that you do. Feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentations, but know that we're going to try to answer those after the presentation is over. We're going to show you here quickly how to use the Q&A. But first, next slide. I want to thank our funders. Without their support, without their gracious support, we wouldn't be able to bring these types of sessions to you right now, particularly without any charge. So here are our foundation partners who've invested in NAO and support us to do the important work we do. Next slide. We also receive corporate sponsorship from these folks. Very much appreciate their support in helping us as well to bring this kind of information to all of you. Next slide. So I did want to point everyone to the Oregon Wildfire Resources page that we've put together. You can go on there. We're regularly updating that with new resources. There are updates there as well from the state as to what's happening. And we're working directly and regularly to try and get more information so that you can help the communities, the people, the families who've been displaced and who've been impacted by these wildfires. So please check that out on our website. Then next slide. I also just wanted to put a quick plug in for the Public Space podcast that we just launched last week. We've got one of those podcasts out now. We'll be adding to that here month by month. And so take a look at that and listen. And the very first one was about adapting and changing in crisis situations. So we think that that'll be very germane to what you're all interested in. Next slide. So on how to ask questions, you'll see in this graphic here, there should be a Q&A button to the side. If you could put your questions in there, and there should be like buttons in there as well. Rather than ask a similar question to what someone else has already asked, if you could just like their question, then I can keep track of, okay, we've got one question here that's very germane and interesting, and we've got 7 people all, wanting that question asked and getting an answer from Regine and Kim. So I'll try to prioritize that way. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Regine Webster and Kim Maphis Early.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Regine Webster, and I'm joined by Kim Maphis Early today, and we're going to lead you through a conversation over the next 20-25 minutes that talks about disasters and what's happening in your community and how we can move toward an equitable disaster recovery. Slide, please. So, quick overview of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. We're an organization that was formed in 2010 with the desire really to support the private philanthropic community as they think about preparing for and responding to disasters. We knew way back when that following events like the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 or the Pakistan earthquake or Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we knew that there was a real need amongst the philanthropic community to have a one-stop shop, right? The Kroger or the Circle K, where the philanthropic community could come to for just thoughtful and credible conversation about disasters. We do our work through 3 different pillars. The first is through the educational resources that we offer, and that's anything from a 500-word blog filled with genius that Kim might write, all the way through the work that we do with Candid, formerly Foundation Center, where we track, monitor, and analyze disaster giving. And we're going to show you some of that data in a moment here. We also have grant making and recovery funds. Right now we have a North American Wildfire Fund, as well as a California Wildfire Fund, as well as an Atlantic Hurricane Season Recovery Fund, and a COVID-19 Response Fund. So very much, that's the place where we are very much event driven. And then lastly, we run a suite of consulting services where we help the funder community do strategic planning around disasters. We help do convening and learning opportunities, cohort learning opportunities. We do a bunch of research as it relates to disasters and disaster philanthropy, all through our consulting work. We are an 18-person team located nationwide, north to south, east to west. We actually have been virtual since inception. So Kim and I, we represent what we like to refer to as CDP Southern Command. We are both based here in Nashville, Tennessee. Slide. In terms of our takeaways, these are the 4 things that we want you all to know by the time that we wrap this hour. One is just this understanding of how disaster dollars move. Like, what's a federal dollar, what's a state dollar, what's a philanthropic dollar, and how can you anticipate those dollars to flow through both a response and a recovery effort like the one that you're currently experiencing. The second is that disaster people, they have a lot of sort of bumper sticker sayings. And one of the bumper sticker sayings associated with disasters is it's a marathon and not a sprint. And so we do want you to be ready for this long haul of recovery. We'd love to unpack some of the roles and responsibilities of philanthropy as it relates to disaster recovery. And then lastly, we have a slide at the end that's chock full of additional resources, our phone numbers, places for you to go to get new and different and more information. Slide, please.
Thanks, Regine. As you may have noted on the introduction slide, before 2021, my hair was black. It is now thoroughly gray. And the statistics I'll present in the next 2 slides both set the context for what we're going to be speaking with you about, but it will also let you know why I don't look like my picture anymore. We wanted to give you all an idea about the basic facts about the situation in the state of Oregon. There are 8 counties in Oregon that have been approved by the federal government due to a major disaster declaration for public assistance, individual assistance, and disaster unemployment assistance. And I want to put a little asterisk by the disaster unemployment assistance because it's only for individuals who do not receive regular state unemployment, pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, or pandemic unemployment assistance. So these are not things to layer in over other unemployment assistance, but are for occasions of job loss due directly to the wildfires. And the deadline for this is October 23 for your applications, and benefits will extend through March of 2021. So please let your constituencies know that this deadline for application is coming up. 12 counties in Oregon have been approved for public assistance, and you can see in that next bullet how many of the individual assistance applications for housing and other needs have been approved, and the total of the federal dollars that have been approved so far. A lot of acreage burned. You see the numbers of homes that have been damaged and destroyed, the numbers of structures that have been damaged and destroyed, and the fatality and injury report. And this is current as of the FEMA report this morning. There's also some relatively good news for the fires in Oregon, is in that some containment is taking place, but FEMA is still at full activation in the state of Oregon. And we know that there's critical fire weather in Northern California with the outbreak of some new fires yesterday in Napa Valley that, begin to encroach on the border of Oregon. So this is not an isolated situation where a disaster ends at a state border. Next slide. This is the situation in Oregon for your COVID per capita response and total numbers of cases, as well as the last 7 days. The New York Times has some new nomenclature for low and staying low, low and rising, high and dropping, or high and staying high. And so, relatively speaking, per capita, your rates are low as compared with other states, but there have been 549 deaths in the counties that I've listed in descending order. And then we are all watching in every state across the union, nursing homes, food processing plants, correctional facilities, colleges and universities, and where there are climate-related disasters, we're also watching temporary shelters because these can be congregate settings where COVID can spread quickly and easily. Next slide. So now we're going to move into what CDP considers its regular daily work, and that is thinking about who's funding the disaster and where the needs are. Next slide. So for your disaster funding 101, local governments are the first responders and the initial source of any money for an emergency response. And when we say local governments, we're thinking about fire, police, EMTs, the folks in public works who do debris removal, local utilities, local nonprofits, and or local affiliates of national nonprofits. So again, local governments and the local organizations are the first folks who have to put up some money. Then when those are exhausted, there's a reach to the state, and they enter into the equation depending on the scale and scope of the event, and when local budgets are really maxed out. And then when the state is tapped out, the governor requests a major disaster declaration from the president, which opens the opportunity for federal assistance and budget appropriations. So when we think about state services, we think about additional evacuation support, programs to help people recover, or mitigation projects and preparedness activities, and activities that have the opportunity to reduce the risk of loss of property, injury, and death in a future disaster. And when the federal government gets involved, that's when the acronym FEMA starts to play a large role in what you see in the press and what you hear in your statewide reports. And FEMA can assist with response and planning support, cost sharing to reimburse local and state governments, and also with programs for individuals, families, and communities. Next slide. So there are damage assessment thresholds that determine two streams of federal aid. The first is for individual and household assistance, and that's the highest level of damage award to a state. And you'll see that eight of your counties qualify for that. And then the public assistance threshold, and that's for public infrastructure, public buildings, public structures. And the thresholds for when a state qualifies for either of these declarations is shifting, and it's currently in fairly hot debate as more frequent and more severe disasters have become part of our public landscape. Next slide. So individual assistance is for individuals and households, and it goes to individuals and households for uninsured and underinsured losses. And as of May in 2019, the average award was about $5,000, and the maximum is $34,900 for housing assistance and $34,900 for other needs assistance. But neither of these amounts will replace what you've lost if you've lost everything, your housing, your job, your property. And you have to apply for these funds. And we learned tragically, for instance, in Puerto Rico after Irma, that when you don't have electricity and your cell phone connections are unstable, you may not be able to apply at all. So it's really important for public infrastructure to make available the access to the application forms. And if you have a home loan and your home is uninhabitable, you still have to pay your mortgage. So some of the additional loans that are available that are administered by the SBA of up to $40,000 for creditworthy homeowners and renters to repair or replace their personal property loss or their real property loss to its pre-disaster condition may not be an avenue for a lot of folks who are already in debt or cannot be deemed creditworthy. And although interest rates are capped for these loan programs, and they're lower if you cannot find credit elsewhere, the maturity times for these loans vary, and that's another factor that's important to consider before a business or a household takes out an SBA loan. But these monies can be used for temporary lodging. They can be used for direct rental from FEMA units. There, things like trailers or other needs assistance for things like storage, flood insurance group rates, funeral, medical, dental, and child care assistance, and also cleaning and removal if the public is not helping with those services. So again, all these resources are dependent upon the type of declaration, the amount of apportionment you receive from the state or the federal government, your personal or business eligibility, and also the support that you receive from other sources. Next slide. Here's some other FEMA resources, some of which I know that Oregonians have taken advantage of. Mass care and emergency assistance. This is immediately after a disaster, and mass care means something differently in COVID than it used to. So there's a lot of additional spending on disaggregated units to provide shelter like available hotel rooms, for instance. FEMA can also provide crisis counseling, which is both a direct assistance and a training program. But the important word here is crisis. One program is only for 60 days after your disaster declaration, and the second is for 9 months. This is not a long-term counseling assistance, and we know that it often relies on mental health infrastructure that may be non-existent in some rural or isolated areas. And we also know that many requests for counseling and also symptoms of distress present themselves long after these crisis counseling programs end. The other program is legal services, which is free to low-income individuals, and it's staffed by the ABA Young Lawyers Division. They have both a help call-in line and personal counsel. This is a big need for all sorts of things like landlord disputes, fraud claims, getting your documentation back together, custody cases, all sorts of things that come up in a disaster where you really need the advice of a professional attorney. Also, disaster case management. This is something we at CDP really try to pound home, that if you are awarded a federal grant for disaster case managers, it really helps to assist survivors with developing a recovery plan to address their long-term needs. But even if you aren't awarded a disaster case management grant, you may need disaster case management. And so that's a place where local funding may be able to provide the support for persons and households that's needed. And finally, there are lots of specialized loan and grant programs through other federal agencies like the USDA, HUD, and the Small Business Administration. And I'll just give an example. The USDA has special programs for farmers and ranchers. HUD has programs for mitigated building projects and low-income housing. Those are just a few, but they're another resource from the federal government. Next slide. This is other support services that come from FEMA. There are lots of acronyms in the world of disaster. One is a VOW. Your regional voluntary agency liaison will serve as a central coordination point between local, state, tribal, territorial, and federal governments and the volunteer side of disaster recovery, which are those faith-based and community organizations that respond in times of disaster. And this includes coordination for volunteers and donations and people providing disaster services. So if your state has a federal declaration, getting to know your VOW and relying on them for good information is really important. The other federal support services are community recovery planning services to set up your individualized cadres to address particular issues around your recovery, and also subject matter experts that can lend their expertise to your planning process. And then to establish any long-term recovery groups in and around your state. Next slide. I thought I'd do two quick scenarios, not only to demonstrate what needs are like and who's responding, but also to help you think about the equity considerations in disaster funding. If you have to evacuate from a wildfire, first of all, you need access to communication that lets you know it's time to leave. You need transportation. You may need temporary housing. You may need medical care or utility support. Perhaps you're medically dependent on oxygen, or you have to keep your insulin refrigerated. If you don't have a cell phone, or if you haven't paid your phone bill, or if you rely on public transportation, all these issues may come to bear in ways that disproportionately and negatively impact you during an evacuation. Because you don't have cash reserves, you may or may not have adequate health insurance to cover what you need. Now, local and state resources can help with both evacuation assistance and a variety of forms and platforms to communicate evacuation orders and instructions. They can provide care for large numbers of people, temporary housing, and your local nonprofit service providers will also help during this time with issues like feeding, medical assistance, care for pets who may be service animals, but also companion pets, or if you have a rancher or a farmer, assistance with your livestock. Federal resources typically aren't available at this stage. If you have a hurricane, you have a lot of advance notice, and so you can rush in and help and pre-position things. But fires, tornadoes, derechos, all these sorts of things move quickly and unexpectedly. So the federal government may not have advance warning that a major disaster is unfolding. And so it's primarily up to the local community. Next slide. Again, early relief. So you've been evacuated or you've found good shelter, and your needs may again be communication and transportation, temporary housing. You may need to get damage assessments of what you've lost or what's been damaged. You may need medical and utility support. And here again, you may use your own personal cash reserves, insurance, home, property, business loss insurance, business interruption insurance, health insurance. And local state resources can provide support here with care, temporary housing, unemployment insurance, and then nonprofit service providers, again, primarily locally and statewide, are filling gaps to help folks in the early relief period. The federal resources are also there if there's been a major disaster declaration, but it's important to remember that the clock starts ticking for your individual assistance registration and your IA and PA applications as a state when the declaration occurs. Sometimes the federal government is benevolent in extending that application period, but not always. So it's important to remember that communicating with your constituencies and your stakeholders is really important when it comes to registering and applying for these services. Next slide. Here's what the roles that we believe and have experienced nonprofit service providers lending to disaster recovery. They're active through the entire process, from the time there's a warning through long-term recovery. Some may have local, state, or federal MOUs to take up work, but all are deployed and coordinated through the appropriate emergency management authority. That's really important because you don't want to show up with volunteers when utilities aren't up and safe. You don't want to show up with volunteers when you have first responders in a search and rescue operation. So relying on your emergency management authority to let you know when it's appropriate and important for you to step in as a nonprofit service provider is essential. And the funding sources vary for these kinds of nonprofit services, as you all well know. Next slide. And here are roles that philanthropic organizations and donors can play in disaster. They can be grant makers. They can be neutral conveners as the public begins the recovery process. They can be advocates for underserved and also advocates for nonprofit service providers. We saw in the distribution of funding for the CARES Act that in states where there was strong advocacy for the nonprofit service providers, that money more easily reached nonprofit folks who had extended themselves to respond to COVID-19. Philanthropic organizations can also be advocates for changes in policies and regulations that might either inhibit recovery or might produce a more equitable and long-term recovery. And also, philanthropic organizations can be active in educating stakeholders throughout the communities about the state and stage of the disaster recovery and where the needs are. I'm going to turn it back over to Regine.
Okay, great. And Jim, I'm going to hope that you as the moderator don't mind. I'm just going to go really quick because I see this question about undocumented individuals. And I want to draw a point through here that there are 4, I hate this word, classifications of individuals that are not eligible for disaster benefits, okay? So they are a person who's on a non-immigrant visa, such as a work, a student, or a travel visa, not eligible for FEMA dollars. A person who is, I have a list, this is a temporary protected status, so TPS, not eligible for FEMA benefits. A deferred action, a person who's DACA, a DACA person, deferred action for childhood arrivals, not eligible for FEMA benefits. And then finally, a person that has a pending asylum application. So if they have a temporary Social Security number, they are also not eligible for FEMA benefits. And again, as I put in the answer in the Q&A box here, my knowledge of that, I have to cite Kate Vickery of the Houston Immigrant and Legal Services Corporation, who was a real champion for the city of Houston following Hurricane Harvey. So just, she's worthy of a citation for sure. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. We annually, with our friends over at Candid, again, formerly Foundation Center, put out a report called Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy. And what this report does is it seeks to track, monitor, and analyze about 12 or 13 different data sources and how those funding streams go toward disaster. Slide, please. And just a quick backup overview, which is to say what I'm surmising you all already intuit, which is to say that in the United States, philanthropy is very reactive in its orientation to disasters. So we know that philanthropy, by the end of 4 weeks following a disaster, over a third of private giving is complete. At the end of 2 months, 2/3 of private giving is complete. And at the end of 6 months, there's by and large no more funding from private philanthropy for a particular disaster event. So, none of us want to consider our nonprofit partners to be too quick on the draw and from a fundraising perspective, but we really know if they don't fundraise in this immediate wake of a disaster, or even in the case of Oregon, while the disaster continues to unfold, we know that they unlikely will have the dollars that they need to do the type of recovery work necessary. Slide, please. So in 2017, so put your head around this, right? We've got Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Maria. We've got two earthquakes in Mexico, and we have California wildfires that spike late October, early November. In 2017, we were able to track, monitor, and analyze $504 million coming from private philanthropy, with the vast majority of those dollars going to natural disasters, and the majority of that going to storms. So very clearly going to Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Fewer than 1% went to man-made accidents and complex humanitarian emergencies, such as the protracted Syrian refugee crisis and the, again, protracted Rohingya refugee crisis saw 12% of philanthropic giving. So very much geared toward rapid onset natural disasters. Next slide, please. Aha. In this slide, I know it's tiny, but we're going to send you the slides afterwards so you'll be able to see and stare at this bar graph. What this bar graph shows you is that in addition to focusing almost exclusively on storms and natural disasters, philanthropy responded overwhelmingly in support of response and relief, 64%. What that means is that reconstruction and recovery dollars were far lower, only at 17% of dollars. So again, you see that intentionality of let's meet those immediate needs. Let's get there. Let's get the water. Let's get the mass care. Let's get shelter taken care of. But that when it comes to long-term housing rebuild, long-term economic development, livelihood, mental health needs. The dollar pool, the sheer dollar pool is much smaller when it comes to foundation funding. Slide, please. This is just a quickie and shows you that 72% of all funding from foundations went into North America. That does not cover Mexico. Mexico in this rubric gets captured under Latin America and Mexico. So 11% at the bottom that you see there is arguably a lot of that is for those two earthquakes that hit. Slide, please. Now here's where things get really interesting, because this is the slide that shows the other funding streams, such as corporate giving, online giving from Network for Good, online giving from Global Giving, DAFs such as Fidelity. You see $60 million in 2017 went through Fidelity, and then individual giving from the Vanguard DAF recognizing $20 million. On the other side of that table, if you kind of scroll down, you see that FEMA dollars awarded in 2017 amounted to $15.6 billion with a B, So when you count up the, say, the fewer than 750 million, no, I'm counting wrong, fewer than $900 million in philanthropic funding, and compare that against one federal agency, FEMA, at 15.6 billion, you can see how critically important it is to understand FEMA dollars and how those dollars flow, and understand how to best work with FEMA. HUD underneath, you see in 2017, they allocated $2.7 billion. They have a much longer funding tail. So we expect that in this year's report that comes out in just 6 weeks, we see that the HUD dollars will start to climb upwards. So I hope that this particular slide really underscores the importance of understanding what IA is and what PA is. Slide, please. This slide really just reflects the year-over-year total amount of giving by foundations. And what you see here is that in 2017, there was definitely an uptick given the number of natural disasters. So philanthropy gave considerably more than they had in previous years. The closest year to that that we tracked was 2014, where there were $225 million. That was for the Ebola outbreak in East Africa. And of that $225 million, two funders made up $100 million. There was $50 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and $50 million from the Paul G. Allen Foundation that went for the Ebola response. Slide, please. And I'm going to turn this back to me. Back to Kim.
Here we have what we think are the top 4 tips we can give you today for best practices. One is know your voluntary community leaders and your emergency management personnel so that you can sit at their tables, both for getting current and accurate information, but also for lifting your voice as funders and nonprofit service providers in terms of what you know people need. Listen to the affected community and visit impacted areas if possible. There will be formal leadership in those communities as well as informal leadership that has the pulse on what the needs are, and they may not be what FEMA recommends. It may be another aspect of recovery that's crucially important to that community. So listen to the community. Gather damage and needs assessments first, including that intel from leaders, and then look for gaps in services and funding. Don't start throwing money out the door before you know where the needs are, and look for things that aren't going to be funded by local, state, or federal dollars. And leverage your existing relationships with other philanthropic peers, current donors, and the nonprofit community. So be alert to what other folks are doing, and go with the folks you know and trust. Next slide. Some more best practices. Develop a platform for regular updates and information sharing. I've been through lots of disasters in the states in which I've lived, as well as the states in which I work. And sometimes it's really important early on to have a weekly call so folks know what's what, and then it can reduce over time. But have a trusted source where you can all go. You already have a wonderful collaboration between philanthropy and the nonprofits that is exemplified by this webinar. So keep relying on these communication platforms. Prepare for your own increased operational expenses and strains. So don't always be thinking about moving money out the door, but be thinking about what's happening internally so that you can be there for the long haul to do this work. This sounds, it has an exclamation point, but I mean it seriously. Stay in your lane. If you are an affordable housing funder, this is not the time to learn how to be a performing arts funder. It's a disaster. There will be another funder who can attend to the performing arts. But lend your expertise and your specific experience to the conversation. Collaborate, both in terms of information sharing, but also perhaps collaborate in funding and services so that you can have the maximum impact and avoid duplication. Be kind to yourself. I think that's something some of us who are accustomed to always responding have had to learn over these last few months. Simplify any application and reporting processes so it's easy for the organizations or the populations who are going to receive your services and funding to get it easily and to not have to collect extraneous data that may be important to you, but adds just another burden to them. Be transparent with the public and your funding sources about what you're doing, even if you mess up, or even if you're not as quick to start as you'd hope, just let people know where you are. And finally, update your own continuity of operations plan and keep it current. Because as we've learned, when one disaster hits, another might hit at the same time. And you need to know what your evacuation plan is. Are all your important documents saved to the cloud? Who's going to be in charge if someone is stricken ill during the process? All those kind of eventualities. Write it down, share it, drill it, update it. Next slide.
And actually, if you can do one more forward, because I'm gonna go really short on these last slides to make sure we have Q&A time. So Disaster Philanthropy Playbook, it's disasterplaybook.org. It is a resource that is largely designed to serve place-based funders, a la the membership of Grantmakers of Oregon and Southern Washington. Although I would certainly encourage the Nonprofit Association of Oregon members to take a peek as well. It's an interactive website that looks at different strategies such as housing, such as mental health, such as education, such as livelihoods, and looks to unpack how funder communities can address those particular strategies. Slide. And this is our last slide, which is a couple of additional data sources. One, we have a Prosperity Now scorecard. Well, it's not we have a link to the Prosperity Now scorecard that we think is a really great resource to look at policy measures and state and local outcome measures. The Pew report on state spending for disasters is amazing. And then we have state and metro area impacts of COVID-19, followed by county health rankings and a roadmap for COVID-19. Those are just a few resources. You should also use our phone numbers as a resource and our emails as a resource, as well as the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar at disasterphilanthropy.org. So that's it for our formal presentation. We'll just pop the mic back over to the West Coast.
All right. Thanks, Regine and Kim. We really appreciate all those great insights. And we do have some questions. Regine, you were able to answer a few, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into a couple of these. One that I think is maybe a little easier is the disaster unemployment that Kim mentioned at the very top there. Is that applied for by a person through the regular Oregon Unemployment Division, or is that a special process that they go through with FEMA or with the state?
It's with the state, but it depending on your state, it may be a separate office. So call your local state unemployment office and ask them how they are handling the disaster assistance unemployment program. I apologize, I did not check on how Oregon is operationalizing that grant, but it differs from state to state.
Okay, and we will look into that as well and try to get a clear answer in the package that we send out to all of you after this. In terms of, I want to ask one more, and then we're going to get into this issue of undocumented people, because I think that's going to be one that we might need to spend a little time on. But in terms of FEMA benefits for IA, so that's the individual assistance claims, are they typically signed up through local nonprofits, or can you describe how FEMA uses its process, its website or phone numbers, and help break down eligibilities or available resources within any individual's local community? Is that all done through the VALs, or can you describe a little bit more about that?
There's an online registration form, and that's just to register that you're a person who may need assistance. And then eligibility determinations come in slowly as damage assessments come in, and you know what the apportionment of dollars is for the particular disaster based on damage assessments. And that's another so that's the kind of FEMA part of this. For the disaster case management, that's where you begin to layer resources, and that's why it's so important. So again, FEMA assistance is probably, if you get $5,000, that will be helpful, and you should be grateful for your $5,000, but that is not long-term recovery funding. And so once you have your insurance, your personal insurance or business insurance tells you what it's going to pay, and then you look at what unmet needs are, you may get some FEMA assistance, and then you may rely on the nonprofit community and your long-term recovery group's unmet needs committee for additional funding. But a disaster case manager can take you through that whole process. And again, if you don't have insurance and you don't have personal resources, then your eligibility may go up, but that doesn't mean that FEMA is going to raise your award past the maximum. And again, it all depends on what's being apportioned. It's why it's so important to have senators who will lobby on behalf of your state for a really strong FEMA apportionment.
Thanks for that, Kim. So we actually just posted in the event chat, so this is not in the Q&A section, so over in the events chat, the Disaster Unemployment Assistance website, where you can, where the individuals whose employment was directly affected by the wildfires can qualify for disaster unemployment assistance. So that website is in the chat right there. Turning a little bit to the situation with people who may be experiencing homelessness, can they get assistance through FEMA or through any of these mechanisms?
So I have an imperfect answer, Jim. I don't think so. At least they would have had to have had an address before the event. They can get FEMA assistance living in a Red Cross shelter, but the key is having an address before the event, since it's for housing.
And that's where support for nonprofits who provide services for the homeless comes into a big gap, and is important to remember.
Great. I want to turn to this issue of undocumented people. We know specifically two of the towns that were badly hit, Talent and Phoenix, has a very large Latinx population, and there is information that there may be people who are undocumented in those communities. The federal assistance, we saw what Regine talked about relative to federal assistance. So can you talk about what kind of examples of states, philanthropy, and nonprofits working together to make sure that those community members who may be immigrants without documentation status are supported? Are there live examples you can give us, or any suggestions?
This is okay. I'll start, Kim, and then you make me better. Okay. So two examples of organizations that I know do really strong work is one, the Latino Community Foundation based in California. They're very attentive to the needs of the migrant population that may have either mixed status or undocumented status. So that's certainly an organization I would look to. And I'm not sure the geographic range that the UndocuFund touches. I don't know if they make it as north as you all, but they're certainly in California, and they too, right, their sole work is to support individuals who are undocumented, and they have a specific focus also on disasters. So two strong organizations. I don't want to toot CDP's horn, but I will say when we have been in our grant making role in California for wildfires, certainly looking at undocumented immigrants is a huge piece of what we do, just because the need is so great and the access to resources along with the fear are also, the resources are low and the fear is high.
Regine is right, and I'll also mention if you want to go to our website and look at some of our grantees for Hurricane Harvey in Houston. Again, large population of undocumented individuals and families, and see some of the organizations that we supported there. I don't know any state that is giving direct funding to undocumented persons. So I don't think you look to the government for support there. You look to support your nonprofit infrastructure to meet those needs. Because again, very few individuals or families want to turn over personal information to a local, state, or federal government official in the current climate.
Right. And I would just sort of punctuate that with this is where, implementing nonprofits who have deep community trust and connections are vital to the success of these kinds of programs, because the government does want statistics, and that means they have to go put these people through processes. So even state funds that may be made available, we're lucky here in Oregon that a lot of times our state will step up and meet the need in between what the feds are willing to fund and not. But I've not yet heard of any specific state wildfire relief or recovery funds relative to the undocumented people. So if anybody has any information about that, I'd be more than willing to share that and hear about that.
I just want to underscore, Jim, something that you said too, which is I have another disaster bumper sticker for you, which is that disasters begin and end local. And so when you're talking about the deep connection to local nonprofits, like Kim and I are over here hooting and hollering on that message. Yeah.
I think where this gets complicated, Regine and Kim, for many of us, is that this unknown interconnection of these very sort of static systemic structures like FEMA, like OEMs and groups like that, to the kind of the way that nonprofits, the reason we have such trust in community is it's the way that we work. We start in community, we work, backward and up from there to identify needs, where government tends to start with structure and ask everybody to fit into those structures. And so I do want to just put in a plug for if you are responding to this emergency the wildfires in particular, make sure that you are coordinating locally with your OEM, so your Office of Emergency Management, usually at the county or city level, and also with the what are called the COADs, the either community or county organizations that are active in disasters. Oftentimes it's a group of nonprofits who are actually working in those COADs and helping them to identify the need and then cross-check that the needs are being met and gaps are being identified outside of what the government can provide. As both Regine and Kim said, these are billion-dollar investments that are going to need to be made in these disasters and this wildfire, and it will take years and years and years. So the wise use of philanthropic and nonprofit dollars at this time is really, really going to be critical.
I'll also mention here, Jim, that it's important to track the funding that your state receives. We know from independent investigative journalism that CDP has funded in the past that just as I've encouraged the nonprofit sector to be transparent, it's important to hold the government to a similar standard for transparency about where the dollars are going and to whom, and what you have to do to get those dollars. Because whether through malintention or unintention, oftentimes those billion-dollar funds are not targeted to or spent on the communities most in need. So keep your government accountable for how it spends those governmental dollars.
Right. And that cross coordination kind of lends itself to this other point here, this other question. Red Cross is currently funding food for 12 weeks for those who've been displaced from their homes. But there are concerns that the need will extend well beyond that, especially as we head into the winter. What are some good strategies for looking for longer term funding sources relative to things like the food, the winterization? I can only guess that in a number of these communities, they're not going to be able to electrify and get utilities back into these communities in time to even put FEMA trailers on people's land. So, this person writing in the question box here is saying that food is currently costing about $1 million per month with the level of need. So what are some ideas that you've had in how that need can be met and the coordination it takes?
Yeah, I come to you with only wishing I was sitting next to Sheila Foster, nodding my head vigorously with her. In addition to the shelter food needs, there's also the additional burden of food needs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. We know from our friends over at Feeding America that their current, I'll put it in quotation marks, fundraising goal to meet the expanded food distribution needs because of the pandemic is $1 billion right now. Like that's $1 billion delta from what it had been previously because the kids are at home, people are not in congregate care shelters. Then you have newly in need. So we've got this, terrible pancake here of a pandemic plus a tragic wildfire plus people living in shelters, and they're arguably non-traditional shelters because they're not congregate, they're hotels. It is scary. I think, part of it's going to be philanthropy digging deep. Part of it's certainly going to be governmental dollars that are going to have to be used to that because, we can't leave people unfed.
Yeah.
It's also a place for public policy advocacy because, for instance, and again, I hope that not every state is like Regine in my home state of Tennessee, but the expansion of SNAP benefits, the expansion of Medicaid, all these issues come to bear on public health emergencies as well as climate-related disaster events. So if you have an expanded population that may have access to publicly funded feeding sources, but your state isn't expanding benefits, then you really do have that pancake getting tighter and tighter, as well as nonprofit service providers. So again, the role of advocacy, it becomes really crucial in this as well.
Right. Well, I want to thank you both. We're actually a little over time now. We're right at 11 now. I want to thank you both for all of your expertise and knowledge. I want to also thank my buddy Kendall for co-hosting this. We're going to continue to work together with the grantmakers of Oregon, Southwest Washington, and try to continue to get more information, better coordination. We have a lot ahead of us, folks. It's going to be many years and a lot of leveraging of folks, the power and the access of philanthropy through advocacy, as Kendall put in the chat there. So thank you all. Thank you, Kim and Regine, for your time and your knowledge and your expertise. And with that, we're going to go ahead and stop the webinar and the recording, and we will send this out in our follow-up with you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.